On behalf of the family, I would like to welcome you to celebrate the life of Phil Chubb. We're joined by many here today. It's a full house, including current and former parliamentarians, former Premier John Cain and ministers in his government, Australia's Chief Scientist and former Monash University Chancellor Alan Finkel, former Chief Scientist Ian Chubb, who many of you know is Phil's brother. Family, colleagues, friends of Philip, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mia Lindgren. I'm Head of School of Media, Film and Journalism, and it's a privilege and a huge honour to welcome you to this ceremony as a friend and colleague of Philip. I want to first acknowledge Phil's two sons, Rory and Dan, and former wives Louise Clayton, mother of their two sons, and Suzanne Schubart. The family wishes to thank the Gang of Four, as Phil used to call them, who provided wonderful support and care for him during his illness. Gary Sturgis with partner Kim Rubenstein, Meg Simons, Bill Birnbauer and Emily O'Reilly, and we'll hear some of them talk later today. Phil was an award-winning journalist who, after a distinguished career, went on to establish a second distinguished career as an academic. He continued to be devoted to journalism by inspiring the next generation of journalists, and we see that in the students today. Phil was an outstanding person, and what has really stood out to me during this past week is the consistency in the words people have chosen to describe what they loved about Phil. A mentor, a role model, inspiring, respectful, a kind and generous person with a dry wit and cracking intelligence, an influential journalist and a great bloke. He was a wonderful colleague and friend who always had your back, and I'm personally very grateful to have been in Phil's life during his years at Monash University. So we'll start the ceremony today by hearing from Phil's sons. First, Daniel Clayton Chubb.
A lot of you knew Phil as a friend or a colleague, as a boss or an employee, or an employee who thought he was a boss. To me, he was all of these, and he was my father. You're going to hear a lot of memories and stories about his time as a journalist, as an academic, as a student, as a mate. Hopefully not too much about athletic endeavours. There weren't many and they weren't very good, though they were still better than mine. But now you'll hear about him as a dad. Toward the end of his life, the few days before he passed, I suddenly realised that there were conversations that we were never going to have. There were questions I couldn't ask, stories we couldn't share. So I asked him how he wanted to be remembered, and he said, as a great father, as a wonderful father, which of course he was. So I thought I'd talk a little about that. He always saw the best in my brother and me. Once, with a couple of friends, I turned off the gas at my primary school. We only realised what we'd done when the heating stopped working in the middle of winter. And when he found out, we had a sort of sit-down father-son chat. And he said to me, "Chubbs are leaders, Dan." I didn't really want to tell him that I was already the leader and that it had been my idea all along. Though on reflection, I don't know if he'd have been disappointed or secretly proud. He always communicated with us openly and honestly, and towards the end he told me, "Always be honest, never lie, and you receive in the future what you give." We could talk to him about anything, really. Relationships, anxiety around work or study, Camus, fake news, climate policy or lack thereof, our plans for the future. He lamented our failures, celebrated our triumphs, and certainly didn't pull any punches if he thought we hadn't tried hard enough. Though of course neither did we. When he said he was taking the academic job at Monash, which was obviously a great decision, and that he was going to have to do a PhD while still working at Global Vision, bemoaning the tasks in front of him, I did not hesitate when I called him indolent. Fair turnabout though, I do strongly remember many conversations about my sleeping habits, too much of it, computer game playing, too much of it, and homework never done. But his open and honest communication was occasionally selective. I do remember when my brother Rory was 10 and Dad made him cover up the R rating on an Eminem CD purely to avoid conflict with our mother. But, you know. He also always had time for us, whether it was flying down from Canberra or Sydney during his 7:30 report days, driving hours each way to and from his house in the sticks to put us up or to pick us up from mum's or from school, or loitering near bus stops to sneak me away for a coffee on the way to university. He prioritised us and our time together in a way that many dads don't. It even shaped his career and the opportunities he chose to pursue. Being a present father was so important to him, and he succeeded, and we are and will always be grateful. I could speak forever, really, about the ways he was a great father, but essentially they're an extension of the ways in which he was an amazing man, and I'll let others follow on from here. Thank you all for coming.
Ask Rory to come up. Thank you.
Mine's pretty short and sweet, but I don't really have an anecdote to symbolise the love that my dad and I had for each other. Every single memory I have of my dad is positive and special. He was my confidant, my mentor, and my best friend. We had a deep, unspoken, and profound love, and I'll miss him forever.
I will ask Gary Sturgis to come up. Gary was one of the gang of four.
I'm honoured to be asked to speak about Phil. I know I'm tapping a deep well of shared loss, and all of you will have your own distinct stories about Phil. I wanted to share with you a sliver of my own experience. I'm here to talk about his sporting prowess. I first met him when he was captain of the Don Vale under-16s cricket team. I arrived mid-season at age 13 and, still in short pants, opened the bowling. Phil was fielding at mid-on. In my first over, the batsman hit a lollipop catch to Phil, who nonchalantly dropped it. The very next ball, the batsman played exactly the same shot. Phil put one hand on his hip and drolly stuck out the other hand. In the next ghastly moment, the ball spilled to the ground. It's more than 50 years ago, and I'm not bitter. Revenge was swift. The Chubbs lived near another family in Don Vale, called, believe it or not, the Windsors. As Phil dragged me along to visit them, dropping my catches had bonded us, he said, "Whatever you do, don't talk about politics. They're Liberal voters, goodness knows why. That party's done nothing for them. And don't mention the Vietnam War." Well, as soon as we got in the door, I started a blazing row about conscription and Australia's immoral involvement in Vietnam. I might even have called Menzies a war criminal. No matter, because if you were going to start an argument with anyone, even if told not to, it paid to have a brilliant debater on your side. Phil, then and subsequently, was devastating in argument. He was more than a match for anyone he encountered on the way up, certainly the Windsors, Bob Hawke and Paul Keating too, anyone really. That mental strength, that driving, logical, forensic and ferocious intellect was wrapped up in all Phil's work, and certainly was the reason behind the extraordinary success of Labor in Power, a tour de force that changed the way politics was reported and seen in Australia. But back to boyhood. Phil had, for a time, went out with my sister Paula, who's here today, for a month or so while they were in high school. I remember walking behind them on their first date. Phil moved to the outside and draped his coat over my sister's shoulders. I'm not saying he was the kind of guy who'd give you the shirt off his back, but he'd certainly give you the coat. I think my family still has it. In my case, he'd give me books. Those he didn't give me, I took. I'm still madly whiting out his name from many of them. By the way, my sister had the good sense to choose friendship over romance, and I much preferred my status as best friend to possibly former brother-in-law. Phil, I hope you don't mind me saying, had a pyrotechnic romantic life, and I came to observe that through the years. It was hugely exciting when Phil was selected as the Age newspaper's only graduate from hundreds, if not thousands of applicants. This was when the Age was an Australian institution, and I was all ears for his "guess who I met today" stories. On the day of the Whitlam dismissal, he kept an open line to me from the editorial floor of the Age, telling me the latest moves: a no-confidence vote in the caretaker government, the Speaker is off to see Kerr won't see him, heady days. We shared student digs and other digs on occasions, even lived in my parents' house when my father was off on his protest yacht sailing to the Mururoa Atoll test site. We might have lived there longer had not the French atomic bomb gone off before the boat arrived. We waited expectantly for the Age to lob each morning. Fridays were great. The Nation Review came. We loved the New Statesman, the New York Times Weekly Wrap, the German Tribune. We read them all. Phil wrote his history honours thesis on the French revolutionary figure Saint-Just, doing all the reading in French. He was a scary figure in Phil's reenactment of him, let alone in the flesh. Both of them lost their heads, Phil figuratively. As a student, I worked 2 days a week in his parents' factory, the Gold Shield Nut Company. His father, Ian, was great, a strong, gentle man. I worked best at coffee breaks and lunchtimes. I threatened to sue the company, the estate, Phil, anybody I could think of, now it's the boys, for industrial back soreness, sustained during one of the breaks. Just the other day, I was sitting awkwardly and Phil asked me if my back was sore. He'd just had 2 gruesome back operations, so I figured he had every right to empathise with me. To this day, I don't know if I was right to serve the writ on him as he sat propped up in his hospital bed. He didn't seem to mind. He indulged me throughout his life. We had 1 year at Monash Law School together. I used to ambush him in the library stacks by pushing books down on him from the aisle as he passed underneath. He didn't seem to mind. Perhaps I was the younger brother he never had. He had many nicknames. My father called him Little Felipe. I remember Lou Clayton and others calling him Chubby Checker. Chubby was the more usual address. An unkind wag at the ABC dubbed him the Angry Ant. My children lovingly called him Sweet Chilly Philly. Me, I was always Burge or Burgie. We did so much together. We worked at The Age. After my first opinion piece on the High Court, I think, I remember him saying, "Gee, people grow up fast in this place." We were at the ABC. We co-authored a significant book. It was great. He did 80% of the work and I got 80% of the credit. It was a good formula, as Bill Birnbauer came to know in another book that I co-wrote. Phil and I were in business together. Never work with your friends is a good maxim, but we survived the experience easily in the end. We went to the football together and I lured him to barrack for North Melbourne, although he often hovered between the Blues, his son Rory's team, and the Roos. We loved Ron Barassi, a Blue and a Roo. I was working in Washington when Phil rang me from Canberra. "Where are you?" I asked. "Sitting on a bed in a guest house at the lodge," he answered. "In a guest room at the lodge," he answered. "Cool," I might have said. He'd just met with Hawke, who'd agreed to having the Hawke Labor government filmed from the inside. When I came back to Australia to work on the television series that became Labor in Power, all that had changed. Paul Keating was now Prime Minister. Labor in Power was so close to not happening at all. But it did happen, and the rest is riveting history. There were poignant, odd hints of what could be future trouble. I remember being in his 7:30 report office at the ABC. Burgie, what could possibly be wrong with me? The room's spinning, I feel dizzy, disoriented. What do you think it is?" Well, Phil, I don't know what it is. You've got the nicotine patch, you're chewing Nicorettes, you're chain smoking. I don't know what it could be. Perhaps it's an anxiety attack. Of course, he'd given up smoking many years before his illness, but the whole journalism world had fueled his habit earlier on, and while ever outwardly calm, inside he was coiled with stress. It couldn't have helped. In the dying months, he worried at all the passive smoking I'd done in his presence. It didn't worry me particularly. I just polished up the second writ and handed it to him. "What's the catch, Burgie?" he might have asked. No catches, Chubby. That was the whole trouble. But of course, I'm not bitter. But I think all of us here are bitter to a degree. We're bitter about the next 10, 15, 20 years, maybe more, that we might have had in the endless charm of Phil's bounteous company. But for all the untimeliness of his going, he endured his savage illness with incredible grace, and I am amazed and heartened by the outpouring of fond remembrance centred on Phil and his extraordinary outreach to others. What a mentor he was to so many people. As one of them told me recently, for a small man, he was an incredibly big man, It's so true. He died brave, he died hugely loved, strangely rounded and at peace, and, of course, still living on in the hearts and memories of hundreds of people whose lives he directly touched. Yet even with that world of memory, we'll miss you, sweet chilly Philly.
Thank you, Gary. We will now have a reading by Rory Sutton.
My first contact with Phil was when he worked for Time magazine Australia. At that point, he'd written a highly critical article about ABC drama. And as manager television down here in Melbourne, I sought a right of reply. I received a less than complimentary response from him in language we cannot repeat in this circumstance. Not long thereafter, Phil came to the ABC to produce Labour in Power, which Gary mentioned, with Sue Spencer, Sean Landers and others. It took us a while to meet face to face, but when we did, I was struck immediately by his intensity, his intellect, and his sense of humour. Never one to fear the future, on leaving the ABC, he pioneered the establishment of Global Vision Media, where they produce websites and online learning materials. Global Vision, Phil's vision, continues to this day. It is Phil's capacity to live in the moment that may have been inspired by his love of T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets poetry. I'm informed that he was able to recite every line in competition with Meg Simons, substance-assisted or not. East Coker first appeared in 1940 and is the second of the 4 poems in the Four Quartets. Like the other 3 poems, East Coker was written in strong stress meter and organised into 5 sections. It continues the study of cyclical patterns begun in Burnt Norton, the first of the quartet, and it examines the nature of history and spiritual renewal. East Coker, incidentally, is named after the hamlet in Somersetshire where Eliot's ancestors lived before immigrating to America in the 1660s, a site he visited in 1937. The poem is bleak in tone, with images of deserted streets, subterranean shelters and hospitals. It expresses the sentiment that, for us, there is only the trying. The rest is not our business. So here's the first part of East Coker. In my beginning is my end. In succession, houses rise and fall, crumble, are extended, are removed, destroyed, restored, or in their place is an open field, or a factory, or a bypass. Old stone to new building, old timber to ashes, to fires, old fires to ashes, and ashes to the earth, which is already flesh, fur and feces, bone of man and beast, cornstalk and leaf. Houses live and die. There is a time for building, and a time for living and for generation, and a time for the wind to break the loosened pane, and to shake the wainscot where the field mouse trots, and to shake the tattered arras woven with a silent motto. In my beginning is my end. Now the light falls across the open field, leaving the deep lane shuttered with branches, dark in the afternoon, where you lean against a bank while a van passes, and the deep lane insists on the direction into the village, in the electric heat, hypnotized. In a warm haze, the sultry light is absorbed, not reflected by grey stone. The dahlias sleep in the empty silence. Wait for the early owl. In that open field, if you do not come too close, if you do not come too close on a summer midnight, you can hear the music of the weak pipe and the little drum, and see them dancing around the bonfire, the association of man and woman in dancing signifying matrimony, a dignified and commodious sacrament. Two and two necessary conjunction, holding each other by the hand or the arm which betokeneth concord. Round and round the fire, leaping through the flames, or joined in circles rustically solemn, or in rustic laughter, lifting heavy feet in clumsy shoes, earth feet, loam feet, lifted in the country mirth, mirth of those long since under earth, nourishing the corn. Keeping time, keeping the rhythm in their dancing as in their living in the living seasons, the time of the seasons and the constellations, the time of milking and the time of harvest, the time of the coupling of man and woman and that of beasts. Feet rising and falling, eating and drinking, dung and death. Dawn points, and another day prepares for heat and silence. Out at sea, the dawn wind wrinkles and slides. I am here, or there, or elsewhere in my beginning. And then the final part 5, home is where one starts from. As we grow older, the world becomes stranger, the pattern more complicated of dead and living. Not the intense moment isolated with no before and after, but a lifetime burning in every moment, and not the lifetime of one man only, but of old stones that cannot be deciphered. There is a time for the evening under starlight, a time for the evening under lamplight, the evening with the photograph album. Love is most nearly itself when here and now cease to matter. Old men ought to be explorers. Here and there does not matter. We must be still and still moving into another intensity for a further union, a deeper communion through the dark, cold and empty desolation, the wave cry, the wind cry, the vast waters of the petrel and the porpoise. In my end is my beginning.
Thank you for that beautiful reading. We have 2 final speeches from 2 close friends who were also Phil's colleagues. They travelled the same road from journalism into academia, where all 3 of them continued to express their strong commitment to the importance of journalism. We'll hear Bill Birnbaugh first and then Meg Simons.
Hello everybody. A few weeks before he passed away, Phil thought it would be a good idea if his friends could write about their memories of him. Here is what I wrote, but never had the opportunity to show him because the possibility waned under the weight of his illness. Phil Chubb, the boss I never had. Across the decades, from Snappy Tom to Master's Review, La Cantina to Jelly Beans, Hard News to Behind the News, Pollies to Newbies, Mate, it's all been good with you. It covers our time at the Age, particularly at State Parliament, and our journey into academia at Monash University. I will explain some of the more obscure references in the next few minutes. Phil was an investigative reporter, state political editor, features writer and editorial writer at The Age in the 1970s and 1980s. He was an intellectually ambitious journalist. He was relentless in his search for the truth. 1 or 2 interviews were never enough. He didn't look for great quotes or use overly descriptive language. His stories were built on unvarnished facts and telling observations. This led to his news editor complaining that his stories often were too short, a most unusual trait in the journalistic field. In the run-up to the April 1982 election, it was a torrid time in Victorian politics because the Liberal government had been in power for 27 years and looked likely to lose, though not without a fight. As state political editor, Phil broke front page news daily. His sources on all sides of politics were at a very high level. They trusted and respected him, even when he bucketed them publicly. He never became part of anyone's outfit. Of course, we know that Phil was a master interviewer, as evidenced by Labour in Power and his recent book, Power Failure. Phil's weekly analysis columns had a moral force behind them and were based on research and a deep understanding of history and politics. One of his scoops that I well remember was in September 1981, when the socialist left faction of the Labor Party withdrew its support from the opposition leader Frank Wilkes in favour of John Cain, who is with us today. Splashed across the front page of The Age, the headline read, "Cain set to oust Wilkes," and the kicker headline, 30 Labor MPs pledge votes to change leader. A piercing comment piece ran off the front page. What was extraordinary to me about this, apart from the great journalism, was that Phil had spent most of that afternoon indulging in his other great love, a liquid lunch across the room from Parliament, where he'd regularly hold forth on local political machinations, the nefarious activities of particular advisors, and of course the football. The tip about the revolt against Wilkes occurred late in the day. Phil confirmed it, filed the story and his analysis over the phone straight out of his notes. The next day, as reporters were backslapping and congratulating him, he confessed rather sheepishly that he was somewhat hazy about the events that had followed the third or fourth complimentary port at lunchtime. The thing is, no one challenged the information in the story, and it marked a turning point in Victorian politics. Phil was as unflappable as he was unadorned. One of the younger reporters at State Rounds one night hid Phil's black office phone in his briefcase while he was out of the Age's parliamentary press room. Soon after, it rang, and Phil looked at his desk and around the room, finally located the phone and answered it, "Hello?" as if it were nothing unusual to have the phone in his bag. He had a droll sense of humour. It was in the same press room, packed with journalists and Labor MPs, late one night that he dubbed the then Shadow Health Minister, Tom Roper, Snappy Tom, a sobriquet that stuck. I can still hear Phil singing, "The cats of Australia have made their choice." Snappy Tom, always with a wry smile and kind of rising to his tiptoes. Is Mr. Roper here today? I apologise, Tom, if he is. 25 years on December 1, 2008, we started at Monash University Journalism. Being December and being a university, no one was around. So we went to lunch, of course. As head of journalism, Phil's leadership qualities were apparent to all. He was collaborative, innovative, able to cut through the bureaucracy and get things done. Phil hauled the Monash journalism course into a digital era. He recognised the future of journalism was now and introduced units on smartphone reporting, digital reporting and digital production. He was responsible for designing and obtaining funding for a multi-million-dollar media lab with state-of-the-art television, audio and newsroom facilities. He never wavered from emphasising the basic tenets of journalism to students: accuracy, verification, independence, and having an ethical framework. Phil's contribution to the School of Film, of media, film and journalism, of course, extended to its research with publication of Power Failure, a landmark study of the toxic politics of climate change under Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard, his PhD and numerous other articles, mostly about climate change, in academic journals. The jelly beans, well, I bought those massive packs that you can buy at chemists, thinking that they may give us a lift during the day. They never lasted long because Phil devoured them by the fistful. Phil was the boss I never had. He was generous, kind and loyal, a mentor to me and many other journalists, academics and students. Phil helped people reach their potential. We were all the better for knowing him, and we'll miss him a lot. Thank you.
I don't really know how to say farewell to someone who I've known for the whole of my working life. It feels like saying goodbye to a big part of myself. Phil was my first boss in journalism. I was his cadet for 6 weeks during the election campaign that brought John Cain to power. My job was to fetch coffee and cigarettes, which I should have refused to do on any number of grounds, and run errands, but in between I got to watch him work. I heard him do phone interviews, negotiate off-the-record conversations onto the record, and work and develop his contacts. I heard him talk about independence of thought and of action. I read his astonishing run of front-page stories. I was an incredibly green and naive girl from Adelaide, didn't know what I was doing there, and Phil showed me what journalism was and how it was done. And somewhere in there, this gruff and gentle man and I became friends. Perhaps it began in the pub that night that he said the line from T.S. Eliot, "Let us go now, you and I completed it when the evening is stretched out against the sky." It became a bit of a party trick when we'd had a drink or two, doing line and line about of J. Arthur Prufrock or the Four Quartets. Phil loved literature. Now, how many journalists know their Dostoevsky and can talk about crime and punishment? Phil did, and Phil could. It was a friendship that stuck for 35 years, despite the fact that I spent more than a decade of that time living interstate. And there were times when I felt we were shadowing each other. We were both married twice, both had 2 children, and each ended up running the journalism departments in rival universities in the same city, answering each other's lines all those years. There wouldn't be a single big journalistic project over those years for either one of us that we didn't discuss together and sometimes argue fiercely about. He was not very happy with me for doing a book with Malcolm Fraser. But Phil was the leader. I find it hard to tease us out from each other, but I know he taught me a large part of what I know about being a journalist and about being a grown-up. The thing I can talk about here that others know less about is his union activism. In the early 1980s, Phil decided, rightly, that the Victorian branch of the AJA needed reform and modernisation. Now, Phil, as others have said, was mostly a gentleman, but when he decided to move on someone, he was ruthless. He ran a successful campaign and became president of the branch. I was union rep at the Age at the time, and he persuaded me to join him on the branch committee. So many of the things that we now simply take for granted were won during that period of unionism, and might not have been won as quickly or as well without the reform that Phil led. We oversaw, for example, the establishment of industry superannuation. The AJA in Victoria was at the centre of that campaign, and before it was a legal requirement, the 3% employer contribution was won in an industrial campaign at the Age. Phil was the leader, the strategic brain. I was the one who got to lie in front of a truck on a picket line. Which, of course, I gave him plenty of shit about. Just a week ago, again with him in his hospital bed, we were recalling the Cain government's workplace safety legislation that had delivered great power into the hands of workplace safety reps, of which I was one, at a time when our colleagues were being struck down by the plague of RSI. It's hard to recall now just how frightening that was. Phil was writing about the laws as a journalist, and as unionists we were able to use them to press for action and to help our colleagues. Phil understood what that reform meant politically, and for our colleagues, and for all those workers for whom this was a matter of life and limb. And he was still thinking about that and talking about it in relation to the project which has been his main professional preoccupation over the last year, his book on the Kane government. He asked me to read a draft of the foreword, and the book, I'd have to say, is not complete. I'm going to share one paragraph from that foreword because I think it demonstrates why this was to be an important book. Phil wrote, "The 80s was the decade when competing visions of the role of government fought it out, and the clearest battlefield was Victoria, where the government saw its job as bigger than just getting out of the way. Now, as some of the possible longer-term impacts of the Hawke-Keating revolution are inching into view in the form of chronic underemployment, rising inequality, and widespread alienation from the institutions of government, the contours of this 1980s struggle are perhaps becoming more important to understand than ever. The Kane government represented the alternative Labor vision." That's the end of the quote. Unusually for the time, Phil, as union branch president, backed action on sexual harassment in a couple of very nasty cases, the details of which remain confidential, but which I was involved in, not as the victim, as the unionist. There are women here today who will remember that the union acted on their behalf, arguably not enough, but at a time when this was by no means to be taken for granted. There were other male unionists who didn't think it was an issue, but Phil got it straight away as a simple matter of justice and human dignity, his core values. Phil tried hard to be a cynic, and it would be wrong to call him an idealist, but his key aspiration was to be a decent human being. He had a low tolerance for people who declined to take moral responsibility for tackling injustice. Just a few days ago, he said to me that if people remembered him as having been decent, not just one of those macho newsroom boyos, then that would be good. No worries there, old friend. So now he is gone. Let us go now, you and I. But I can't accompany him. I already miss him profoundly, and I'm less sure now about how to be me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Meg. So that concludes the more formal part of the ceremony. Thank you all for coming today. On behalf of Phil's family, please join us for drinks and some canopies out in the foyer. There will be whiskey. It will be a good time to share stories about Phil, and there will be some cards and books available out there where you can write a note or a memory. And as we leave in here, there will be some photos for us to enjoy as well. And you're welcome to stay here at the Monash Law Chambers until 3:30. Thank you.